In October 1492, Arawak men and women emerged from their villages onto the white sand beaches of the Bahama Islands, swimming out to get a closer look at the massive wooden ships that had arrived on their shores. When Christopher Columbus and his armed sailors stepped onto the land, carrying heavy steel swords and speaking a language completely unknown to the natives, they were met with warmth, curiosity, and hospitality. The Arawaks ran to greet the strangers, offering them fresh water, platters of food, and handcrafted gifts, revealing a cultural foundation deeply rooted in communal sharing and peaceful coexistence.
Inside the dim, wood-paneled cabin of his flagship, Columbus recorded his first impressions of the native people in his journal, noting their physical beauty and complete lack of weapons. He observed that the Arawaks did not know what iron was, having cut themselves out of sheer ignorance when shown a sharp Spanish steel sword. These observations led Columbus to write that with only 50 armed men, the entire population could be easily subjugated and forced to do whatever the Spanish crown desired. The Bahamian Arawaks shared a way of life common among many indigenous peoples of the mainland, characterized by remarkable hospitality and a belief in collective ownership. In stark contrast, the Europe of the Renaissance was driven by a fierce competition for wealth, dominated by powerful monarchs, the authority of the church, and an insatiable desire for gold. Columbus served as the pioneer messenger of this competitive world, where land and gold determined the survival and power of modern nation-states. Immediately upon his arrival, Columbus took several native captives by force, hoping they would serve as guides to lead him to the source of gold. The primary question driving the entire Spanish expedition was simple and relentless. Where was the gold hidden? Having persuaded the Spanish monarchs to finance his voyage with promises of immense wealth, Columbus was desperate to find riches that would justify his journey. Spain in 1492 was a newly unified modern state, where a tiny nobility, comprising just 2% of the population, owned 95% of the arable land. The country had recently expelled its Jewish population and driven out the Moors, aligning itself completely with the Catholic Church in a campaign of religious unification. Gold had become the ultimate symbol of wealth and power in this changing economy, far more versatile than land, because it could buy armies, goods, and political influence. With the Ottoman Empire controlling the traditional overland trade routes to Asia, European powers desperately needed a direct sea route to secure silks and spices. While Portuguese sailors attempted to navigate south around the tip of Africa, Spain decided to take a massive gamble on sailing west across the uncharted ocean. To secure his services, the Spanish crown promised Columbus 10% of all profits, governorship over any new lands discovered, and the prestigious title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea. Columbus set sail with 3 small ships, the largest being the Santa Maria, manned by a crew of 39 men who faced an uncertain journey across the Atlantic. He had severely underestimated the size of the Earth, believing Asia to be thousands of miles closer than it actually was. Without the unexpected presence of the American landmass, Columbus and his entire crew would have perished in the vast, empty expanse of the sea. In early October 1492, 33 days after leaving the Canary Islands, the crew began to notice small branches and green leaves floating in the water. They watched flocks of birds fly overhead, a welcome sign that dry land was near after weeks of seeing nothing but water. Tension mounted on board as the sailors scanned the horizon day and night, desperate for the first glimpse of land. On the night of October 12th, a sailor named Rodrigo saw the bright morning moon shining on distant white sands and cried out to alert the crew. The first man to sight land had been promised a lifelong pension of 10,000 maravedis from the Spanish crown. However, Columbus claimed he had seen a faint light the evening before, securing the financial reward and the credit for himself. The Arawaks lived in communal villages and practiced a highly developed form of agriculture, growing maize, yams, and cassava. While they knew how to spin cotton and weave textiles, they had no horses or work animals, relying entirely on human labor and cooperation. They possessed no iron tools, but the small gold ornaments they wore in their ears immediately caught the attention of the Spanish visitors. Desperate for information, Columbus ordered his men to round up several Arawaks and hold them as prisoners on board the ships. He insisted that these captives guide his fleet to the lands where gold was abundant, forcing them into a harsh and unfamiliar captivity. This marked the transition from peaceful encounter to active coercion, setting a dark precedent for the years of colonization to come. The Spanish ships sailed through the Caribbean, arriving first in Cuba and then moving on to the large island of Hispaniola. In Hispaniola, the sight of tiny gold particles glistening in the riverbeds sparked wild fantasies of immense gold fields among the sailors. A local chief presented Columbus with an intricate gold mask, which further fueled the Spanish belief that they had discovered a land of unlimited riches. When the Santa Maria ran aground and was wrecked, Columbus used its heavy wooden timbers to construct the first European military base in the hemisphere. He named the fort Navidad and left 39 crew members behind, with strict orders to find and secure the sources of gold. The establishment of Fort Navidad represented a permanent armed presence, transforming the nature of the European arrival from exploration to occupation. Before sailing back to Spain, Columbus's men clashed with a group of Indians who refused to trade their bows and arrows. In the ensuing struggle, 2 Indians were run through with steel swords and bled to death, marking the first recorded deaths of the conquest. The remaining ships, the Niña and the Pinta, then set sail for Europe, carrying the captured Arawaks into the cold Atlantic winter. As the ships moved north into colder latitudes, the tropical indigenous prisoners began to fall ill and die from exposure and disease. The harsh oceanic environment and lack of immunity to European diseases turned the return voyage into a journey of suffering. Despite the mounting deaths of his captives, Columbus remained focused on the triumphant report he would deliver to the royal court in Madrid. Upon reaching Madrid, Columbus presented an extravagant and highly exaggerated report to the Spanish monarchs, claiming he had reached Asia. He described Hispaniola as a fertile miracle, claiming its rivers were filled with gold, and its mountains contained massive mines of precious metals. These fictional accounts were designed to secure further funding and guarantee that another, much larger expedition would be authorized. Columbus reported that the natives were incredibly naive and generous, willing to share everything they possessed without hesitation. He promised the crown that with a little royal assistance, he would return with as much gold as they needed and as many slaves as they requested. He framed his actions in religious terms, declaring that God granted victory to those who followed his path, shielding his economic goals with holy language. Driven by the promise of immense wealth, the Spanish court financed a massive second expedition, consisting of 17 ships and over 1,200 men. This was no longer a voyage of discovery. It was a fully equipped military invasion designed to extract gold and establish a slave colony. The fleet sailed back across the Atlantic, carrying the weight of Spanish imperial expectations and the instruments of conquest. Upon returning to Hispaniola, Columbus found that the fortified outpost of Navidad had been completely destroyed and burned to the ground. The 39 sailors left behind had been killed in battles with the local population after they had roamed the island in armed gangs. The sailors had taken native women and children by force for labor and sex, provoking a desperate and violent retaliation from the tribes. In response to the destruction of the fort, Columbus ordered heavily armed expeditions deep into the mountainous interior of Haiti. The soldiers searched desperately for the mythical gold fields, but found only empty villages as the native populations fled into the hills.
To justify the immense cost of the 17-ship fleet, the Spanish commanders realized they had to return with some form of valuable cargo.
In 1495, the Spanish forces launched a massive slave raid, rounding up 1,500 Arawak men, women, and children from the surrounding areas. They locked the captives in makeshift wooden pens, guarded by armed soldiers and fierce attack dogs, preparing them for selection. The Spaniards selected the 500 healthiest individuals to be loaded onto the ships bound for the slave markets of Spain.
Of the 500 Arawaks forced onto the ships, 200 died during the agonizing journey across the cold Atlantic Ocean. The dead were cast into the sea, their bodies lost to the waves as the surviving captives faced an unknown fate in a foreign land. Those who survived the journey arrived in Spain, only to be put up for sale by local ecclesiastical officials who treated them like animals.
Columbus reported that the natives were incredibly naive and generous, willing to share everything they possessed without hesitation. He promised the crown that with a little royal assistance, he would return with as much gold as they needed and as many slaves as they requested. He framed his actions in religious terms, declaring that God granted victory to those who followed his path, shielding his economic goals with holy language.
Realizing that too many slaves were dying to provide a steady profit, Columbus turned his focus back to the forced extraction of gold on Hispaniola. In the province of Cibao, he ordered every native over the age of 14 to collect a set quantity of gold dust every 3 months. Upon delivering their quarterly quota, the natives were given a small copper token to hang around their necks as proof of payment.
Any native found without a copper token had their hands chopped off by Spanish soldiers as a warning to others. Left to bleed to death in the forests, these victims served as a gruesome reminder of the absolute authority of the Spanish masters. The task was impossible. The only gold on the island consisted of tiny, scattered grains in the rivers, rather than rich, concentrated veins.
Desperate to escape the impossible gold quotas, thousands of Arawaks abandoned their villages and fled deep into the mountainous interior. The Spanish forces hunted them down relentlessly, using trained war dogs, track hounds, and light cavalry designed for rugged terrain. Those who were captured were executed publicly, their deaths serving to break any remaining spirit of resistance among the population.
The Arawaks attempted to organize an army of resistance, but their simple weapons were no match for Spanish military technology. They faced disciplined soldiers equipped with iron breastplates, loud muskets, sharp steel swords, and terrifying war horses. When the Spaniards took prisoners, they executed them by burning them at the stake or hanging them in groups of 13 to mock religious symbols.
Faced with total defeat, many Arawaks began practicing mass suicide, drinking deadly poison made from the wild cassava root. Mothers drowned their own infants to spare them from the horrific tortures and lifelong enslavement of the Spanish mines. Within just 2 years, through murder, mutilation, and desperate suicides, half of the 250,000 native inhabitants of Haiti were dead.
Once it became clear that no significant gold fields existed, the surviving Indians were divided up and forced into slave labor on massive estates. These estates, known as encomiendas, functioned as brutal labor camps where natives were worked to death at a ferocious pace. By 1515, the native population of Hispaniola had dwindled to roughly 50,000. By 1550, only 500 remained alive.
The primary historical source for these events is Bartolomé de las Casas, a young priest who participated in the conquest of Cuba. For a time, Las Casas owned a plantation worked by Indian slaves, but he eventually gave it up to become a fierce opponent of Spanish cruelty. He spent his later years writing his massive History of the Indies, preserving a detailed record of the atrocities committed in the Americas.
In his writings, Las Casas described the Arawaks as agile, healthy, and capable of swimming vast distances, particularly the women. He noted that while they occasionally fought minor battles with neighboring tribes, these conflicts were small and fought out of personal grievances, rather than imperial ambition. Their society lacked complex military structures, having no standing armies, professional soldier classes, or military captains.
Las Casas was deeply surprised by the high status and freedom enjoyed by women within Arawak society, which contrasted with European customs. Marriage laws were highly flexible, allowing men and women to choose and leave their partners as they pleased without jealousy or anger. The ease of childbirth and the casual attitude toward nudity among both sexes stood in sharp contrast to the rigid modesty of Renaissance Spain.
The Arawaks had no formal temples or organized religion, living instead in large communal bell-shaped houses that could hold up to 600 people. They highly valued colorful bird feathers, beads made of fish bones, and polished green and white stones, which they used for personal adornment. To the confusion of the Spaniards, the Arawaks put absolutely no commercial value on gold, silver, or other metal commodities.
Lacking any form of commercial trade, the Arawaks did not buy or sell goods, relying entirely on their natural environment for their sustenance. They were extremely generous with their belongings, expecting a similar spirit of sharing from their friends and neighbors in times of need. This lack of private property and material greed made them vulnerable to the aggressive, commercial drive of the Spanish invaders.
In his early writings, Las Casas had suggested replacing native labor with stronger black slaves from Africa, believing they would survive the harsh conditions. However, he later repented deeply when he witnessed the horrific cruelty inflicted on black slaves under the plantation system. He realized that the drive for profit would inevitably destroy any group of human beings forced into the machinery of colonial labor.
Las Casas noted that the Spanish conquerors grew more arrogant and conceited with each passing day of their absolute rule. They refused to walk even short distances, forcing the native people to carry them on their backs or run in relays with hammocks. The complete domination of one group over another stripped away all moral restraint, leading to a culture of absolute cruelty.
To test the sharpness of their steel blades, Spanish soldiers thought nothing of knifing passing natives by 10s and 20s. 2 soldiers once met 2 native boys carrying colorful parrots, took the birds, and beheaded the boys simply for amusement. The native population quickly realized that defense was impossible and that they had no one in the world to turn to for protection. In the gold mines, the native men were forced to strip mountains from top to bottom, split massive rocks, and carry heavy dirt on their backs. Those who washed the gold were forced to stand in cold mountain rivers, with their backs bent continuously for hours on end. After several months of this grueling work, up to 1/3 of the men died from sheer physical exhaustion and exposure. While the men were sent far away to die in the mines, the women remained behind to cultivate the soil under brutal Spanish supervision. They were forced into the painful and exhausting task of building thousands of agricultural hills for the root plants. This separation meant that husbands and wives were only together once every 8 or 10 months, leaving them exhausted and depressed. With the mothers overworked and malnourished, they had no milk to nurse their newborn babies, causing a massive spike in infant mortality. In Cuba, Las Casas witnessed 7,000 children die in the span of just 3 months due to starvation and lack of care. This cycle of death in the mines, in the fields, and among the infants rapidly depopulated what had been a vibrant and fertile land.
When Las Casas first arrived on Hispaniola in 1508,
He estimated that millions of native people had already perished from war, slavery, and the mines. He wrote that future generations would find it hard to believe that such widespread destruction could occur in so short a time. Thus began the historical legacy of the European invasion, defined not by peaceful discovery, but by conquest, slavery, and death. Despite these historical records, the history books given to schoolchildren often depict the arrival of Columbus as a heroic adventure, free of bloodshed. Columbus Day is widely celebrated as a triumph of exploration, with the darker realities of colonization omitted entirely from the story. Only rarely do standard educational materials hint at the systematic violence and exploitation that followed the discovery.
Samuel Eliot Morison, the distinguished Harvard historian, wrote a popular biography of Columbus in which he addressed the historical violence. Morison noted that the cruel policies initiated by Columbus and his successors resulted in nothing less than complete genocide. Yet he buried this harsh truth in the middle of a grand romantic narrative, quickly shifting focus back to Columbus's superb seamanship.
Historians rarely lie outright about the past, but they often omit crucial facts that might lead readers to undesirable moral conclusions. By stating a dark truth quickly and then moving on to more positive details, they suggest that mass murder is simply an unimportant footnote. This technique of historical writing minimizes the impact of atrocities, treating them as a necessary price to pay for human progress.
Just as a mapmaker must flatten and distort the shape of the Earth to create a usable drawing, a historian must select and emphasize certain facts. However, while the mapmaker's distortion is a technical necessity, the historian's selection is often deeply ideological. This selection supports specific political, economic, or national interests, presenting a biased view of history as if it were a universal truth.
Traditional history is written from the point of view of the conquerors, leaders, and diplomats, presenting them as representatives of the whole nation. This approach creates the illusion of a single national interest represented by the decisions of governments and courts. In reality, nations are divided by fierce conflicts of interest between the powerful and the powerless, the conquerors and the conquered. As the statesman Henry Kissinger wrote, history is often treated merely as the memory of states, focusing on the actions of their leaders. From this elite perspective, peace is restored through diplomacy, ignoring the millions who suffer from the policies of those very leaders. For the working classes, the enslaved, and the colonized, this state-centric world was not a peaceful community, but a place of exploitation and violence.
To understand the true history of a nation, we must refuse to accept the memory of states as our own. We must choose to tell the story of the discovery from the viewpoint of the Arawaks, and the story of the Constitution from the standpoint of the slaves. This approach reveals the hidden struggles and resistances of ordinary people, offering a different understanding of human progress.
In a world defined by conflict between victims and executioners, the job of thinking people is to refuse to stand with the executioners. This does not mean romanticizing the victims or indulging in useless historical anger that depletes our moral energy for the present. Instead, it requires a skeptical view of all governments and their attempts to unite people under a false common interest.
If history is to be creative and anticipate a better future, it must highlight the past's fugitive moments of compassion and solidarity. It should focus on those brief flashes when people showed their ability to resist oppression, join together, and occasionally win. Our future may be found in these hidden episodes of cooperation, rather than in the solid centuries of state warfare.
What Columbus did to the Arawaks of the Bahamas, Hernando Cortés would soon repeat on a massive scale against the Aztecs of Mexico. The Aztec civilization had built enormous stone constructions, developed complex writing systems,
and established a powerful empire. Yet, like the Arawaks, they welcomed the strange, bearded visitors with hospitality, unaware of the conquistadors' singular focus on gold.
The Aztec king, Montezuma, sent 100 swift runners to Cortés, bearing magnificent treasures of gold and silver wrought into beautiful designs. Along with these gifts, Montezuma sent messages pleading with the strange white men to return to their homeland across the sea. The sight of such exquisite gold only intensified the Spanish desire to march on the Aztec capital and claim its riches.
Cortés began his march of death, using deception to turn different native factions against one another and paralyze their will to resist. In the city of Cholula, Cortés invited the unarmed headmen of the nation into a great public square for a peaceful meeting. Once they were gathered, the Spanish army blocked the exits with cannons and horses, massacring thousands of unarmed people down to the last man.
When the march of murder was over, the majestic city of Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. Montezuma was dead, and the Aztec civilization was shattered. The Spanish conquerors looted the temples, melting down priceless cultural artifacts into crude gold bars to be shipped back to Europe. This violent conquest was repeated in Peru by Francisco Pizarro, driven by the same desperate search for gold and slaves. This colonial plunder served to finance the rising monarchies of Western Europe and spur the growth of a new monetary economy. It marked the beginning of what Karl Marx would later call the primitive accumulation of capital, the violent foundation of modern business. The intricate global system of technology and politics that would dominate the world for 5 centuries was built on this foundation of conquest. In the North American colonies, the English settlers adopted the same patterns of violence and deception established by the Spanish. In 1585, before a permanent settlement was established, Richard Grenville landed in Virginia and met the local native population. When a native stole a small silver cup from the expedition, Grenville retaliated by burning down the entire native village and its crops.
Jamestown was established inside the territory of the Powhatan Confederacy, which initially maintained a cautious, peaceful stance towards the English. During the brutal winter of 1610, known as the Starving Time, some English settlers ran off to join the Indians, where they would be fed. When summer came, the colony's governor demanded the return of these runaways, but Chief Powhatan refused with proud and disdainful answers. In response to the refusal, the English governor sent armed soldiers to take violent revenge on a nearby Powhatan settlement. They killed 15 villagers, burned their homes, cut down their growing corn, and captured the queen of the tribe and her children. In a display of absolute cruelty, the soldiers threw the children overboard into the water and shot them, later stabbing the queen to death on land. Alarmed by the rapid growth of English settlements, the Powhatans launched a massive, coordinated attack in 1622 to defend their lands. They killed 347 English men, women, and children, striking a severe blow to the expanding colony. From that point forward, the English abandoned all attempts at peaceful coexistence and committed themselves to a war of extermination. Unable to easily track the highly skilled native woodsmen, the English developed a strategy of feigned peace and systematic starvation. They would allow the Indians to plant their corn peacefully, only to attack them right before the harvest, destroying their entire food supply. Through this ruthless cycle, the English avenged their losses many times over, slowly clearing the land of its original inhabitants. Years before, Chief Powhatan had addressed a prophetic plea to the English leader John Smith, warning against the futility of war. He questioned why the English chose to take by force what they could easily have through peaceful trade, friendship, and love. He warned that if driven into the woods, The Indians would hide their provisions, leaving the English to starve in a land they sought to conquer. When the Pilgrims arrived in New England, they too settled not on empty wilderness, but on land already inhabited by active native tribes. The governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, created a legal excuse to seize native land by declaring it a vacuum. He argued that because the Indians did not cultivate the land in a European manner, they had only a natural right rather than a civil right to it. To justify their aggressive expansion, the Puritans turned to biblical passages that promised the land of the heathen as an inheritance. They argued that anyone who resisted their authority was resisting the ordinance of God and would bring damnation upon themselves. This religious framing transformed a practical land grab into a holy crusade, stripping away any moral hesitation about the use of force.
The Puritans lived in an uneasy truce with the Pequots, a powerful tribe occupying southern Connecticut and Rhode Island. Seeking to control the fertile Connecticut River Valley, the Puritans looked for any excuse to launch a campaign against them. The murder of a white trader and troublemaker in 1636 provided the perfect justification to launch a punitive military expedition. A military force left Boston with orders to execute the native men of Block Island, spare the women and children, and claim the island. Finding the villages deserted as the inhabitants hid in the thick forests, the soldiers systematically destroyed the native crops. They then sailed to the mainland, raiding Pequot coastal villages and burning their food reserves to force a confrontation. As the English forces approached, the Pequots ran along the shore, calling out cheerfully and welcoming them, unaware of the impending war. They did not think the English intended to fight, demonstrating a tragic innocence regarding the nature of European warfare. This misunderstanding allowed the English forces to land and position themselves with minimal resistance, setting the stage for a massacre.
To avoid facing seasoned Pequot warriors, Captain John Mason decided to target an undefended village of non-combatants on the Mystic River. His objective was not a standard battle, but a systematic massacre designed to terrorize and break the enemy's will to fight. He ordered his men to set fire to the closely packed wigwams, trapping the sleeping families inside the burning village.
Those who attempted to escape the flames were immediately cut down by English swords or shot as they ran from the gates. William Bradford described the event as a sweet sacrifice, praising God for delivering their enemies so quickly into their hands. It was estimated that over 400 Pequots, mostly women, children, and elderly, were burned or killed during the raid.
The Puritan theologian Cotton Mather celebrated the victory, writing that hundreds of Pequot souls had been brought down to hell that day. The English continued their campaign, systematically using rival native tribes against one another to prevent any unified resistance. The Pequots learned a painful lesson, that the English would break any promise when it suited their advantage, and that their warfare knew no mercy.
Following the war, the Pequots were completely scattered, their survivors enslaved or absorbed into other tribes. A historical footnote from the 20th century recorded that only 21 official Pequot descendants remained in Connecticut. This thorough destruction of an entire society cleared the path for unchecked English settlement and agricultural expansion.
40 years after the Pequot War, the Puritans clashed with the Wampanoags, who occupied the south shore of Massachusetts Bay. The English found an excuse for war in the murder of a Christian native, launching a preemptive campaign to seize Wampanoag territory. The elite of the Puritan colony pushed for the war, even though many ordinary white settlers initially refused to fight.
The Wampanoags fought back fiercely, matching the violence of the settlers in a desperate bid to preserve their homeland. By the end of the conflict in 1676, the English had won, but at a massive cost of 600 of their own men and drained resources. Over 3,000 native people were dead,
including Chief Metacom himself, whose body was mutilated by the victors.
In addition to warfare, European diseases like smallpox decimated the native populations, who had no natural immunity. A Dutch traveler in 1656 noted that the native population had been melted down to 1/10 of its original size by these epidemics. On Martha's Vineyard, a population of 3,000 Wampanoags was reduced to just 313 over a century of contact. The founder of Rhode Island, Roger Williams, criticized his fellow settlers for their depraved appetite after the great vanities and shadows of land. He compared their obsession with acquiring vast tracts of wilderness to the desperation of starving sailors seeking food. In a society based on private property, this real human need for space was transformed into a violent mechanism for destroying entire peoples.
This raises a fundamental question. Was all this bloodshed and deceit a necessary price for the human race to progress from savagery to civilization? Many modern historians have argued that the benefits of Western civilization ultimately outweigh the tragic losses of the indigenous populations. But this judgment can only be made if the voices of the victims are ignored or buried under a mass of other, more comfortable information.
This sanitized view of progress may be acceptable to the privileged classes of the conquering nations, but it is not acceptable to the victims. The poor of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and the descendants of slaves in urban ghettos have paid the price for a progress they rarely enjoy. Even within the advanced nations, the factory hands and miners who died by the thousands from accidents were the casualties of this same drive.
If sacrifices must be made for human progress, is it not a fundamental principle that those to be sacrificed must make the decision themselves? We may choose to give up something of our own, but we have no right to sacrifice the children of others for an uncertain future benefit. This ethical standard challenges the easy justifications offered by political leaders and scholars throughout history. Furthermore, the immense wealth stolen from the Americas did not even benefit the majority of the Spanish population. The gold and silver gave their kings a temporary advantage, allowing them to hire foreign mercenary armies to fight endless European wars. Spain ultimately lost those wars, leaving behind a ruined peasant class, a starving population, and a legacy of deadly inflation. To evaluate what was destroyed by the European invasion, we must look at the rich cultures and histories of the indigenous peoples. They migrated from Asia across the Bering Straits thousands of years ago, gradually dispersing across the entire landmass of the Americas. By the time Columbus arrived, they numbered approximately 75 million people, with 25 million living in North America alone. The Indians perfected the art of agriculture, learning how to grow maize, which requires careful cultivation, harvesting, and husking. They also developed a wide variety of other crops, including peanuts, chocolate, tobacco, squash, and natural rubber. These agricultural breakthroughs occurred independently of the developments taking place in Asia, Europe, and Africa at the same time.
While some tribes remained nomadic, others built magnificent, permanent settlements nestled into cliffs and canyons for protection. About 1,000 years before Christ, the Hopi and Zuni Indians began building large terraced villages with hundreds of rooms in each complex. They developed complex irrigation canals, produced beautiful ceramics, and wove high-quality cloth out of native cotton.
In the Ohio River Valley, another sophisticated culture developed, known to history as the Mound Builders. They constructed thousands of enormous sculptures out of the earth, serving as burial sites, fortifications, and ceremonial centers. These peoples participated in a vast, continental trading system, exchanging ornamental copper, shells, and weapons across thousands of miles. By the year 500, a massive urban culture was developing in the Mississippi Valley, centered on the great city of Cahokia.
This vibrant city housed up to 30,000 people and featured specialized craftsmen, including jewelers, potters, and copper engravers. Their monumental architecture and sophisticated social division of labor matched many contemporary achievements in Europe and Egypt. In the northeast, 5 powerful tribes bound by a common language united to form the League of the Iroquois. This union included the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas, creating a powerful confederacy based on mutual defense. The legendary Mohawk chief Hiawatha envisioned this alliance as a strong circle that could not be shaken or broken by any external force. In the villages of the Iroquois, land was owned and worked in common, and houses were considered common property shared by several families. Hunting was done cooperatively, and the catch was divided equally among all members of the village, ensuring no one went hungry. This cooperative way of life fostered a deep sense of social equality and community responsibility, with no concepts of private ownership. Women enjoyed extraordinary power and respect in Iroquois society, serving as the clan mothers who held the authority to select and depose chiefs. Lineage was traced through the female line, and families were organized around the woman's clan, reflecting a matrilineal social structure. This gender equality stood in stark contrast to European societies, where women were legally and socially subordinated to their husbands. Iroquois children were raised with great gentleness and freedom, with no physical punishment used to discipline them. They learned cooperation and self-reliance by participating in the daily activities of the community rather than through rigid instruction. This nurturing environment produced independent, confident individuals who possessed a strong sense of personal responsibility to their tribe. The League of the Iroquois was governed by a sophisticated oral constitution known as the Great Law of Peace. This system allowed for local autonomy while maintaining a unified council to handle external relations and settle disputes peacefully. This political model of federated democracy would later influence the thinking of several European American founders. The European invaders often claimed they were bringing order to a wild and untamed wilderness inhabited by primitive savages. In reality, the native populations had actively shaped and managed their environments for centuries, using controlled burns and agricultural planning. The resulting landscapes were rich, productive, and highly sustainable, far from the chaotic wilderness described in settler diaries. As we review this history, we are faced with an unavoidable choice of perspective that shapes our understanding of the present. We can choose to celebrate the achievements of the conquerors, accepting their violence as a necessary cost of modern progress. Or we can choose to listen to the cries of the poor and the sacrificed, recognizing that their struggles define the true search for justice.